Good evening, friends. Welcome to this session of the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, where we are launching a very exciting, interesting, thought provoking, and insightful book. And it's my honor to introduce both the person who will be chairing the session as well as the author herself. Chairing the session would be Avik Chanda, a dear friend of Tata Steel Kalam, and he's a man of many parts. He's done consulting. He's an entrepreneur, but we at the Literary Meet remember him and know him as an author. Avik's last book was Dara Shiko, The Man Who Would Be King, and he has written novels before that and is also a poet. He'll be in conversation with Ghazala Wahab. Ghazala Wahab is the executive editor of Force, and she has co-authored a book with Praveen Sani called Dragon on Our Doorstep, which was a highly appreciated, acclaimed, and praised book on India's cross-border relationship and military prowess in relation to China. Her current book, Born a Muslim, is the book we are going to launch today. And it's a book that speaks of all that I've known Ghazala for 25 years, 26 years actually. And, what she always brought with her was courage, integrity, and a certain diligence and elegance. And this book is informed with all those qualities. So, without much delay, I'd like to welcome you to this conversation, and over to you, Avik.
Malvika, thanks so much for that generous introduction.
Okay, before we really get cracking, Avik,
Yes.
I think we should all hold the book together and launch the book. In our current pandemic, this is as
Virtual
good as
launch.
it gets. But I would urge you all to please buy this book. Ghazala is a very special person. She's an inspirational woman. She has been at the forefront of many movements, including the Me Too movement, which we should discuss at another time and another place. Today, it's all about Born a Muslim, and I'd like Avik to take the conversation forward. I hope our audiences have a great evening.
Thank you, Malvika, for this such a warm welcome.
Thanks, Malvika. Very good evening to you,
Thanks.
viewers, and a very warm welcome to you, Ghazala.
Thank you.
So, this is a book, as we were discussing the other day, that this is a book which is infused with insights right through, literally cover to cover. But let me go against tradition and begin at the end instead of beginning at the beginning, right? Because one of the most impactful sections for me for the book is the conclusion, where you are really, with an unflinching, unwavering eye, laying out the entire sort of spectrum of malaise that is there, um, facing the Indian Muslim community. And it's the budget season, so let me start with economics. And this is something that you have talked about, citing not just anecdotes but studies and statistics and findings. What is it that is really harming in an adverse way the economic growth and development of the Indian Muslim community?
Thank you, Avik. Starting from the last page is also my favorite way of reading a book. So I'm very happy that we are starting with the conclusion. You have rightly pointed out that there are factors which are stopping or which are impeding the economic development of the Muslim community and in India. I will come to the education part later, but basically the root is education, poor access to education. But coming to economic activities, because of poor education, the ability of a Muslim to get absorbed in the mainstream employment sector are very, very bleak. Most of them are not competitive enough to compete for either the government jobs or the private sector jobs. Now, apart from the fact that there is systemic prejudice at certain levels, maybe junior levels or entry level, The other problem is that even in the private sector, probably till a few years ago there was less prejudice. Now there is greater prejudice, and I will point out something which I have mentioned here in the book, that even the private sector, the ability of a Muslim senior level executive to bargain for equal pay, equal in relation to his non-Muslim counterpart, is very, very poor. Apart from the fact that of at the senior level, in levels of senior executives and directors, only 2.6% are Muslims. But even this level of Muslims, or this 2.6%, they do not draw the salary equivalent to a non-Muslim.
Hmm.
Similarly, a person who is qualified in a specific field, a technical field like a chartered accountant or an engineer, the possibility of this person actually finding job commensurate with his qualification is also very poor as compared to the other people. As a result, despite having studied or spent this much of money on this level of education, when a person is unable to find the job, that disillusion with the whole education system also sets in. So a person who is qualified to be an engineer starts giving mathematic tuitions to children. So obviously his salary, his earning capacity is much lower.
Yes.
It's because of all this, a large number of Muslims are in self-employed and in mostly in a unorganized sector, which is
Hmm.
small and medium sector. Medium is
Absolutely.
also as rampant as a small sector industry. A large number of them are underemployed in this same sector, because if it's a family business, then all brothers, everybody just gets involved in that business, and they're really not bringing any value either to the business or to their own lives. So the one of the sectors which employs a large number of North Indian Muslims has been the leather and the cattle industry. Leather also is a byproduct of the cattle industry. So
Hmm.
whether it's meat or it's leather, whether it's processing of skins
So
to make,
processing of meat or tanneries, for
yeah,
example. Right.
or making the shoes, making the final product.
Yes.
This uh, large number of Muslim community, in fact, disproportionately are engaged in this business. I
Hmm.
have some statistics from one of the surveys which says that in UP alone, one in 1,000 Muslims are engaged in this industry. So that's a substantive number. Now, when the government changed the policies against cattle trade, and by trade I don't mean buying and selling alone, but the whole process of slaughter, including even the buffaloes in the restrictions, and earlier the restrictions were limited to the cattle, the cows or the bulls, which
Hmm.
could be used, which had agricultural use, but now there has been a blanket restriction. Apart from the fact that the government has restricted this, it has created a sentiment among certain group of people, the lumpins, which are not hesitant at all to take law in their own hands, and they've become the vigilant groups. They are trying to enforce, which is not even there in the law. So this whole uh, psychosis which has developed,
Hmm.
it has forced a lot of people to either leave this industry or find ways of surviving by doing something or the other, changing their names or moving out of UP. A lot of people, a lot of industry moved from UP to West Bengal. So that transition happened because of this fear. So the at one level, their absorption in the mainstream employment sector is not
Is
promising,
is poor and has been
poor
poor traditionally.
traditionally. On the other hand, the self-employment industry, which gave them some sort of economic succor or support, even that is becoming extremely difficult. The consequence of this is that a lot of people, uh, their earning capacity has come down over the years, and the prospects of their children improving upon the life of the parents. That
Of the parents.
intergenerational
Mhm.
upward mobility
Yes.
is poorest amongst the Muslims in among all communities in India.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
this has been a real setback.
So
Economic.
Ghazala, let's, just connecting the dots here, right? Particularly when you're talking about the younger generation and the ability of the children to be able to do better economically than their fathers. And the primary vehicle, the primary engine for that is education, right?
Right.
And this is something that you alluded to. So now I want you to hone in on saying what ails the education when we're talking about children from a traditional Muslim background.
See,
What are
there,
the
there
challenges?
are okay. There are three factors here, as I see them. One has been the religious part of it, the traditional historical factor, where a large number of Muslims, not just in India but elsewhere, also used to feel that as long as they're Quran literate, as long as they know about the religion, that education was enough to see them through this life, because this, in any case, is preparation for afterlife. So this mindset, with this disinterest towards secular education, has been one of the really serious causes of Muslims not opting for secular education.
Mhm,
This was also the reason why Sayyid Ahmad Khan, when he established that Aligarh Muslim University, he had to fight on two fronts, arguing with the ulamas that no, no, this is not un-Islamic, and then convincing the Muslim families and parents that please send your kids here. So that has been a historical reason that Muslims have been slightly wary and abhorrent or lazy of secular education. The other factor after independence, what has happened is because of this whole legacy of violence, so which fueled prejudice and which fueled insecurity, a lot of
mhm,
Muslims uh, kind of fell back into areas where they felt they'll be more secure. Which was how a lot of ghettos came up, a lot of Muslim-dominated areas came up, even in cities where traditionally there were no such places. Now, these are the areas where you don't have good schools, because schools is not just infrastructure, it's not just a building. You also need good quality of teachers.
mhm.
Now, a non-Muslim, finding a non-Muslim teacher to come to these areas is difficult because of, again, the fear, that insecurity. A non-Muslim would not be very comfortable going to a predominantly Muslim area. So they have to find teachers from within the community. Now, if the community itself is semi-literate or not really well qualified, where will it
Mhm.
produce good quality of teachers? The third factor here is that, and this is not specific to Muslim, this is probably true of our education system also, at large. We have not been quick to understand how the whole uh, employment sector is evolving. The jobs, what are the new requirements of companies, what kind of qualifications they expect from their employees, whether it's the preponderance of now computer sciences, and everybody's now, I mean, that is the biggest employer now worldwide. So here, people are still sticking to traditional courses. So a Muslim who does schooling in whatever stream, if he is doing BCom, or if he's doing Bachelor's of Business Administration, what possible job can he expect to get?
Mhm, mhm.
Obviously, it cannot be a job which is as well paying as, let's say, an engineer, a computer engineer, uh, or even a biochemist, or a job, specific fields which are now the new employment generators. So I think a combination of these three have kept them not correctly educated, and hence unemployable.
Right. So if I paraphrase that, right, I mean, there are several points of dissonance here. The first is, of course, um, if you're talking about the skills of the future, right, or the workforce of the future, it's changing dynamically. It's fair to say that it's completely disrupted, and it's being continually disrupted even as we speak on an ongoing basis. And the pandemic has
Absolutely.
just exacerbated the problem. Now, in that kind of a scenario, even the premier education institutes are grappling, they're trying to come to terms, and they're really trying, at times struggling to come up to the level where they are being able to give courses that cater to the future, not of the
Yes,
past, not of the present, but the emerging future, right? So
yes,
that is a challenge in itself. So it is that much more challenging for young students and for children who come from a marginalized or semi-educated or less educated background or community to catch up, because for them the challenge is that much higher
higher.
than
Yes,
for people who are more privileged in other communities, where at least that basic platform for them, right, in terms of science, technology, mathematics, etc., is well grounded, and then they have to have a smaller learning curve than the others. And I
yes,
think the other thing that I also got from you is part of this is also institutionalized, because it behoves it actually helps the theological custodians, right, the leaders of the faith, the ulemas, the maulanas, in the respective communities, in the respective mohallas, even at the level of a mohalla, at the level of a local mosque, to continue their own suzerainty, right? To continue their own power position, saying this is sacrosanct. This is the education that you have to do. Uske baad,
yes.
fine, we'll see. But this is right, and coming back and pulling people back to that. I think in kind of
I'll just I'll just add to this a little bit. Uh, See, development of intellect is not something which happens instantly. I mean, you study for a few years and you don't automatically develop a capacity to reason, capacity to reflect, think, and argue. Because our system, our education system, in any case, instills rote learning. Our whole premise of competitive education is that you have multiple choice questions. So you are not encouraged to think or argue. Now, if you are used to this kind of learning by rote and generation on generation, your intellect in any case doesn't grow beyond a certain point, so your capacity to absorb new ideas is limited. Now this is
Mhm.
worse in the case of Muslims, because even the religious education now doesn't encourage reasoning. I mean, at one point in the early 8th century, 9th century, when this whole the Abbasid Caliphate was encouraging the learning, and you know what is called the golden era of Islam, where you had philosophers like Avicenna, and you had people talking of to Greek philosophers, and there was a lot of intermingling, a lot of communication between the East and the West thought. But when once you decided that all this is un-Islamic and now we only want to focus on religious education, then there the primary focus has been learning the Quran. So which is why you have things like Hafiz of Quran. You know, you memorize it.
Mhm.
So the focus has been on rote learning even within the religious system. So you're not encouraged to debate or argue or question. So that affects your capacity to then absorb new learning.
Right, exactly. And talk, I mean, maybe going even beyond learning and talking about, faith as it's being lived, as it's being observed or practiced. One of the things, which I thought was extremely courageous of you, by the way, not just insightful, but very courageous, to say that it is as if, going forward, as we go forward in time, being a good Muslim or being a righteous Muslim is being made more and more difficult. So there is the bar of expectation is being raised higher and higher and higher as time goes, right? Instead of maybe certain relaxations, uh, going by the imperatives of the times, we're going the other
Yes.
way around, and there is a huge, uh, emphasis on the dogmatic part of religion as opposed to maybe the philosophical and what you talked about, right? The inquiring mind, right? The philosophical mind, the mystical mind. All of these are, of course, part of Islam, just like part of any of the other great religions. Talk to us about these two sort of dual forces and how that is also working against, you know, and making people insecure in a different way.
See, if you want to control somebody, if you want to wield influence on somebody, then the first step is that you do mind control. And if you allow somebody to think for himself or herself, then that person may start questioning. Then person may become a disruptor to the neat order you are trying to build. So this is something which started happening in the medieval times itself, when Ibn Taymiyyah came and he started questioning the whole Sufi belief, and to going to the extent of actually denouncing Sufis as Islamic, as heretics. And he issued fatwa on against the Sufis, saying that they are fit to be killed. So, and Sufis were the people who had a very non-dogmatic, who had a very easy-going, individual sort of an approach that every human being has to seek his or her path to the truth. So, once this happened, and a lot of our later day Islamic reformers have been inspired by this. I mean, his biggest, not directly pupil, but many generations removed, when Abdul Wahab came, he further chiseled Taymiyyah's opinion, Taymiyyah's beliefs, and he actually said that questioning or discussion or debate is no longer allowed. You just have to you have to be absolutely faithful to what is being told to you. You have to accuse in what is being told to you. So once
So
this
it's basically, would it be fair to say that what we're trying to propagate there is unquestioning, uninquiring obedience, blind obedience?
blind obedience to who has been appointed as your leader or leader of the community, and in this case, a self-appointed leader of the community. So the Indian Islam, I mean, which came through various things and various sources and various ways over the centuries. Towards the 18th century, because of Shah Waliullah, the first Indian who, or not first really, but the Indian who actually brought the secondary Islamic texts like Hadith from Saudi into India, and along with that, a lot of Abdul Wahab's ideas. He sought to reform Islam, rid it of the local Indian influences. So the subsequent Muslim leadership that has emerged, the religious leadership, whether it's at Deoband or Bareilly or Ahl Hadith, they all in some way or the other have been inspired by that, and they have convinced themselves and in turn convinced a large number of Muslims that if something which is easy to do, it cannot be right. So unless it is very difficult, it is not right, because the righteous path is always very difficult.
Always very difficult by definition. Therefore, right.
So they have made religion itself so difficult. I was absolutely astounded to find that there are people who actually dictate to you how much you should bend, what degree your back should be, or how to the ground when you're saying your namaz. They even dictate that. So, which is absolutely ridiculous. The length of your trousers, it should be only these many centimeters above your ankle. Any higher, then it's obscene, and any lower, it is un-Islamic. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous kind of rigidity. But I'm just giving random examples. But this has now percolated to everything. The length of your beard, it should not touch your,
Exactly. So, I mean, you can take it to absolutely, literally absurd levels, right? Every single thing ritualized, codified, and then institutionalized in a way as to make things more and more difficult instead of making it more and more easy. Forget about a Sufi philosophy which you alluded to, but the Wadatul Wajud, where as an individual, if it's a Sufi or a practitioner of any of the Sufi silsilas, could be a Chishti, could be a Qadri, it is that person's equation with the Almighty. And so far as he is traversing the righteous path, there is nobody else, perhaps with the exception of his Khwaja, who is really entitled to tell him this is where you're going wrong, this is what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Now, that is the Sufi philosophy, right? So that has been, what you're saying is completely eroded and replaced by this ultra-conservative, ultra-dogmatic, intrinsically strident, dogmatic way of enforcing things, on life. Would that be fair to say?
No, I agree. And probably Prophet Muhammad realized this, that the moment you create some kind of clergy, you create some, or you appoint somebody as a religious leader, the possibility of uh, tyranny will come in, which is why the Quran itself says that it's between you and your Allah. I mean, each person is his own leader as far as his faith is concerned or her faith is concerned. Nobody can tell you what you are doing, or nobody is supposed to judge whether what you're doing is right or not, whether you're a good Muslim or a bad Muslim or whatever.
Indeed, indeed. Right, exactly. And I'm going to talk about something that you've used a particular term when you're talking about this new trend of revisionism in Islam, and you're talking about the resurgence and the resurfacing of this ultra orthodoxy. You've used a term that you called Arabization, right?
Yes.
And you're saying that a lot of this is really the Saudi Arabian influence, and you're very, very openly critical of it. Talk to us about that phenomenon, why you think it's happening.
See, and this is my personal feeling. I feel that Arabians, they had always been a little insecure vis-a-vis the Persians, because the Persian civilization was much evolved, much more sophisticated. So when Islam came, even then, the entire continent, Arabian Peninsula, was divided into several warring tribes, sub-tribes. As civilization, they were not really as evolved as the Persians were. Subsequently, even when Islam spread and it spread right through Persia and over to Afghanistan, Central Asia, and this region, the Persian influences were carried much faster, as it moved northwards and eastwards. But in India, since it also came through the traders, the Arab traders, so which settled down on the coastal area from Gujarat till Kerala. So they brought a bit of not bit. They brought a lot of Arab influences. In terms of cuisine, in terms of language, in terms of attire. But once the Mughal, not Mughal, but once the Muslim dynasties were established, whether it was slave dynasty or Bengal Sultanate or Delhi Sultanate, and then eventually the Mughals, they were all very Persianized. And once they won or controlled a large part of Indian land, this Persianized form of Islam, in terms of language, in terms of food, culture, dressing,
All
everything.
the intellectual
Spread.
outpourings, the creativity, the literature that was
Literature.
produced, the marvelous, the
And
brilliant literature that was produced through the ages is
yes,
primarily Persian, the
Persian.
language of the
So
courts.
they kind of overtook the Arabic influences which were there in the coastal parts of the eastern coast.
Mhm.
No, sorry, the western coast. So there was a time when the entire Muslim community in India were hugely Persianized. Our court languages, everything was Persianized.
Yes.
So once they discovered oil and once they had money and the Americans came there, that is when they felt that they need to export
Feeding their
now
own power, right?
yes. So they needed to export their cultural or what they
Their
thought was
own brand
cultural
of
values. And their biggest cultural value or brand equity, so to speak, was Islam. So this was helped also by the fact that the whole employment industry opened up in the Gulf. So a lot of these Muslims were then going to the Gulf for employment. But the people who were going from here were not really well qualified, intellectually evolved people. Most of them were skilled laborers who were, in any case, completely overawed by what they saw in the Gulf, which fueled in their insecurities, their inferiority complex. So they saw Arabs being really fancy people, swanky road, big infrastructure, big rich people. So they associated the wealth to religion, to the practice of religion, which they did. So when they used to come back home, they brought that back with them. So that is how this whole process of Arabization started. That one level. The other level was massive funding which they provided to sects or groups which were aligned with them. For instance, Darul Uloom Deoband. So a lot of money was coming in from there. Even Barelvis used to get money. I mean, everybody. They were completely indiscriminate about sending money or giving money to various religious institutions in India.
Mhm.
So that helped in spread of their Arabized religion.
Exactly. And I think to paraphrase this part of the discussion, what we're seeing is there is a marginalization, oblique discrimination, possibly a combination of both at an economic level. There is definitely a marginalization and a sense of deep insecurity for traditional historical reasons when you're talking about education. There is definitely a deliberate sort of styming, right, or stopping off the cultural progress. And
Yes,
now what we're seeing is that there's this Arabization that transcends and which is like all encompassing. And I think the most strident example of that, which I found in your book, is that apparently it is not even fine to say, it's not even correct or appropriate to say Khuda Hafiz. You have to say Allah Hafiz. So I have friends who are Irani, and they would never ever say Allah Hafiz, for example, right? And they've been saying it forever. So
yes. No, so certain people say this, and it is very strange because Arabs themselves don't say Allah Hafiz. But because Khuda is such a Persian word, so
it's
we've
such a
decided
Persian
no
word.
more
So okay, so replace that
to
as
replace
well,
that. Yes,
right? So it's an erosion across the board, economic, educational, cultural, political, intellectual as well,
yes,
right? So
yes.
you remove all of that. Let's maybe move the lens back, Ghazala, because there is a section of the book that talks about Islam in India. So that's a little bit of history, and I want, for the purpose of this discussion, for you to explain to the viewers that Islam comes in as a particular faith, and as time progresses and centuries pass, um, there is this perception about Islam being extremely rigid and being completely opposed to anything else. But the reality that you call out, and this has been the life work of several scholars, Islamic scholars, for example, Richard Eaton has talked about this. Muzaffar Alam Saab has definitely written whole books about this. Is that Islam itself integrates and assimilates so many things which are indigenous, and in the process becomes more comprehensive, becomes more inclusive a faith for people to practice in India. So tell us how that process happened over time.
See, because it came through these multiple sources, it came through traders, it came through Sufis, it came through people looking for better opportunities for themselves, adventurers, and invaders. So everybody brought some of their own into India, or the kind of Islam which came to India. Then, depending upon which part of the country this happened, they came into. For instance, the coastal belt. These were largely traders, followed by Sufis. Then, when
Mhm.
the invaders came, so they were from Afghanistan largely, or Central Asia. So they came, they created some sort of a fear amongst the local, but eventually assimilated them because they could not have ruled here without having local support. So this strand of Islam which came to India through multiple sources also determined the kind of Islam local people who converted or people who came from outside they practiced. So this tolerance was also a part of partly necessity and partly also inherent to the religion itself. Because if you see, Islam has been a very simplistic religion. All you need to do to become a Muslim is just recite the kalma and you are a Muslim. You
Mhm.
really don't need too many complicated rituals. Then the aspect of fixed prayer, you do prayer at a fixed time, or charity. So all this made it appear as uh, a very simple but innately good faith, where people were also caring for others because of charity, because of less rituals, and then seemingly a casteless society, that
Hmm.
everybody
Hmm.
was equal. When you're praying, your ankles should be touching one another. So all this made it really appealing, and which is why a large number of conversions happened. But unfortunately, over a period of time, what has happened is because this form of easily understood and easily practiced religion also involved a lot of a lot of local Indian traditions became part of this. People, so what we call Ganga Jamini, uh,
Ganga
whether
Jamna
it's
Tehzeeb.
tehzeeb, whether it's wearing a particular kind of clothes, or the marriage rituals that you have haldi, you have various, or doing community praying, that whether it's milad or it's Quran Khani.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
all this was something which they adopted, or they learned from the geographical region where it came in India. So
Right.
various so when the reformers came, or people who wanted to Islam to become really an Arabized religion, in the name of reforms, they just wanted it to they wanted to take it back to the Medinan Islam, where when it was founded, when it was like a not rigid, but very specific and very removed from its geography. So that is why, to ensure that people become like that, I have quoted from one of the literatures of Darul Uloom, Deoband, and they said that one of our objectives was to convince the local population to give up Hindu practices. So one of the ways they were trying to convince them to give up Hindu practices was to say that anything which was Hindu, or a Hindu practice which they Muslims were doing, they said it's sin. Now, nowhere in the Quran it says that doing something, wearing a bindi is sin, or wearing a sari is sinful. But
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
they wanted to take people away, and they wanted to create an Islamic identity, so Islam lays down no identity. So they imposed this regulation that anything you do which we tell you not to do is sinful. So that is how the conservatism and dogmatism came. On top of that, you insisted that people only read the Quran in Arabic, learn it by rote, and you are too simple minded, or you are too ignorant to actually understand it yourself. So you have to listen to a religious person for interpretation. So
Hmm.
your reliance on understanding your faith was not on your own self, but it was on somebody else, who could probably be illiterate also, but because he wore a certain attire, because he came with the qualification of being a hafiz or a imam or a ulama, you had to listen to him. You had to give him more brains than you have.
Right. Indeed. Indeed. You mentioned in passing the bindi and the sari, and that brings me to a much larger question that you've dedicated a full chapter in your book to, and that is the Muslim women, or the Muslim girl, or the Muslim girl child, right? So talk to us
Yes.
about the current situation of women Muslims, or girls who are from the Islamic faith. What is their scope for self-development? What is their scope for education? How do you see that panning out in the future? What are some of the opportunities by which they can maybe surmount the challenges that are facing them?
See, Muslim women face the same challenges that Muslim men do, uh, only it is magnified many times more. Because if a Muslim boy at a student has lesser, fewer opportunities of going to a better or a good school and getting a
Hmm.
job, a Muslim woman's or girl's prospects are even bleaker. So the challenges that they face are the same, only that a woman or a girl faces them much more. And a Muslim woman uh, is the last to join the workforce, is the first to exit the workforce whenever a pressure mounts. The another factor which is very closely linked to this is insecurity. Because of the insecurity amongst the Muslims, because of the fear of violence, a lot more parents are reluctant to send their daughters out to study than they are vis-a-vis their son. So, a son can go out of the small locality, can take a chance and go to a bigger school. They they're very reluctant to do that with the girl. The other factor which compounds this is poverty, because they have to balance between the girl and a boy. So they'd rather spend on the boy than the girl. And then there is a last factor which is very strange and very peculiar to Muslim, because the conservatism has been increasing or religiosity has been increasing. A Muslim girl who's considered or perceived as progressive or perceived as qualified thinking person, her prospect of finding a groom reduces, because a Muslim man wouldn't want to marry a better educated Muslim woman, because that her capability or her ability to bring up good Muslim children is suspect.
Hmm. Hmm.
So all of this put together uh, puts her at a disadvantage within the community. Uh, then, of course, now you have things like insistence on hijab. A lot of families are suddenly discovering it, or girls are discovering hijab, and they're saying, "No, no, this is part of my religion." But actually, full face covering hijab or any kind of hijab is more cultural than religious, because traditionally all societies have some sort of a distinctive mark for a woman. Historically, they have a distinctive mark for a woman to put her away from the working class woman. So a rich woman would appear in a certain fashion. That segregation would happen because it reflects on the man's ability to provide for the woman. If a woman is a working woman, then it means that the man has not been able to provide for her. It's bad reflection on his abilities. So all of this puts them at a severe disadvantage.
Ghazala, I want to take you to one of the specific points. There were many that you mentioned, but one of the specific ones is for a young Muslim girl, the struggle and the challenge that she has to convince her parents that let me go outside the immediate family circle, which is bound by values and tradition, and it's a sort of protection, right? And also the physically going away from a hometown, maybe a smaller town or a city, to the big city, maybe one of the metros, and that has been your own experience as well, which is what you call out and which is what you describe so eloquently in the book. If you think back on that time and you think of the struggle that a young Muslim girl today who wants to pursue journalism as a vocation faces, do you think there has been any change in these so many years, right from, let's say, late 80s to right now, or is it still the same?
No, there's a lot of change. In fact, you'll find a lot of Muslim girls and women in the media now. And this is a very remarkable thing that Muslims are disproportionately represented in the media. There are large number of Muslims, both men and women, in the performing arts or in the, uh, you know,
Publicity or entertainment
publicity
and
or
performing arts, yes, exactly, and
mass
media as well.
communication. So
Yes.
there are a lot of Muslims there. Uh, there are certain uh, there are certain communities among the Muslims which has seen reasonable amount of upward mobility. And the caste system plays a little bit of a role here. So Muslims from a certain economic background, Muslim girls and women from a certain economic background have been able to move out, study, live on their own, and lead very progressive modern lives where they are not really looked upon as a Muslim, and they do not identify themselves really as a Muslim. I mean, they are any other professional. But this number of women is very small as compared to the middle or low middle class women who come from probably less privileged background,
Right.
and this privilege is determined, unfortunately, not only by their financial situation, it is also determined from what kind of caste they come from. Which is
Hmm.
this is something I discovered in the course of writing the book, that Muslims also have a caste system, though not as rigid and not as violent as the Hindus, but it is there. You know, there's a working class of Muslims which are skilled laborers, or carpenters, painters, mechanics,
Hmm.
and
Hmm. Hmm.
then there's a further lower caste which is basically into the cleaning business. Uh,
Right.
so the prospects of this class or caste of people moving upward is bleaker than the people who have already, at a certain threshold. People who come from traditionally educated backgrounds, people who have been living in the cities, who have been urban dwellers. So their families, they're third or fourth generation of educated people. So for them to move from their hometown to a big city, uh, or to find employment is much easier than a person who comes from from a background where he or she is the first generation who went to university or college.
Right. Exactly. Mhm. I can see we're beginning to have some questions from the audience. I'll ask one last one from my end, and then we'll go into audience questions. Right at the end of the book, as Alan, I've got it here, you say, and this is literally the last sentence through which you end the book. You say, if Islam is to truly become a religion for all time to come, then each Muslim has to be an integral part of its positive evolution and change. Right? So let me put it this to you. Let me say that there is a girl in her teens who's just passing out of school and wants to take that same leap, right, in terms of going to the big city and pursuing a career for herself, pursuing studies for herself. And she comes to you and asks you, look, I want to do something, I want to make my own mustaqbil for, right? But at the same time, I want to remain true to my faith. What would be the kind of advice that you would give her, that young girl?
See, there is no contradiction. You can be true to your faith. You can be very diligent about your prayers. At the same time, you can study regular secular subjects. You know, you can be a technical person. You can do whatever you want to study, and pursue a vocation independent of what your personal belief is. There should be no contradiction. Uh, if you think your faith is coming in the way of your vocation, then
Mhm.
obviously you have to find a balance, because ultimately your faith is a very personal thing between you and your God. And this is the equation that you have to build at whichever level you want to build with God. But your commitment, your obligations to the society that you're living in, your obligations to raising a new generation of people who can contribute to the society in a meaningful way is far greater. So it's it's depends on each individual how you strike a balance between the two. But I don't see why it should be a contradiction, and why certain ulamas insist that
Mhm.
one cannot happen without the other. I mean, one has to take precedence over the other.
Yes, yes, that it's that this is right and this is wrong, and the two can never coexist under any circumstance, right? And
Yes.
right, and that is probably where, to your earlier point, right, the greater the education, the greater the exposure of all kinds of children, right, uh, across communities, particularly those from underprivileged backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, right? The better the
Right.
chance, the better the probability that they will get a chance to go outside the rut or the morass that their communities and their families have traditionally been hemmed in by, right? And be able to
See,
do something for themselves and make their lives better than in the previous generations.
see there's I'll just add a little bit to this. uh,
Please.
Unless you are exposed to new ideas, unless you are educated in a real sense, and by education I don't mean school academic textbook learning by rote. I mean, if you are you're receptive to challenging ideas, you will not develop or you will not hone the skills to actually challenge anything which is thrown at you by ulamas. See, any religion, whether it's Islam or whatever, it cannot be imposed upon people to rein them back, to hold them back. I mean, religions came so that societies could function in a sensible, organized manner. From so we could learn to coexist. They before the nation states came, before the constitutions or the law came, they laid down a code of conduct by which they thought people could function in a particular reasonable manner without harming each other's interests. So
Mhm.
the whole premise was coexistence in harmony. Now, if your faith or if your beliefs are contradictory to this, and you don't even question if when somebody tells you that, no, no, this is how you should do it, and don't talk to that person, don't go there, don't eat this, or whatever, you should have the faculties to question that it doesn't make sense any longer to me.
Right.
Why should I listen to you?
Indeed. Indeed. Um, we'll take a couple of questions from the viewers, and the first one is from Suhana Ali, and the question is, I'm just going to read it out while I wait for it to come on the screen. She's saying, would you say that cheap labor going to the Gulf has skewed the story of Muslims in India? In particular, the appearance of the Wahhabi practices and the money order economy, for instance. What kind of an impact has this had? I think you mentioned this in passing earlier. So if
See,
you could elaborate on that.
I just broaden this issue. The cheap labor which went to the Gulf, they had no choice but to go somewhere if they were not getting job or employment within the country. If they were getting employment here, if they were getting decent vocations or ways of earning a living here, they wouldn't go there. So this marginalization or this discrimination in employment to the Muslims forced them in a corner, so that when the employment opportunities opened up, they en masse went there. Uh, if,
Mhm.
if if these opportunities were so great, then even non-Muslims would have gone in large numbers. But because they were meager opportunities, yet they were better than what they were getting here, which is why they went there. So this has been a double-edged sword. One, because of the marginalization which happened here, they had no choice but to go there, and because their own upbringing, their own education levels were so poor,
So
that
low that they didn't
so
know
low,
anything better, right?
so they just picked up whatever they were told that, okay, this is the correct way of doing. They could not challenge the ideas which were showing itself to these people. So they had
Mhm,
to just
mhm.
accept what was given to them.
Right. And so, as a result of that, I'm just continuing that argument. So, as a result of that, because they have no frame of reference, they don't have any other sort of platform or any other frame of reference for comparison. And you talked about the erosion of the Persianate culture and the ethos and philosophy
Yes,
and all of that. And because their own standards were so low and they're so aware of the fact, right? So they're so painfully aware of the fact that, okay, this is very low and I come from. So I think there's a very ready acceptance of what you see as the other. The other becomes maybe the sole version of the truth, or the
yes,
only thing to do, or the right thing to do,
and
which
something
wouldn't
you
have been the
aspire
case if you had
for.
a lot of other options, right?
Yes.
Okay, right. So we'll take another question. So this comes from Kobita Banerjee. And she asked, what makes you despair for Muslims in India today? And also, in the same vein, what makes you hopeful for them?
Okay, I'll answer from the Muslims' perspective.
Please.
The What makes me despair is this society that we are turning into. In the last decade, this kind of polarization that has happened, this kind of viciousness, what earlier used to be family, drawing room gossip, that you had prejudice. If you were prejudiced against somebody, you would not voice it in a public forum because you thought it was bad behavior. Now
Hmm.
this has become acceptable behavior. So this has vitiated the whole atmospheric in the country. In our society, we are calling each other all sorts of names. The political leadership is calling Muslims all sorts of names. In an effort to dehumanize them, you hear references like dogs and cockroaches and termites. So this is really has this is added to the insecurity which was always there to some degree, but now it has increased substantially. So this is a part which I despair, because it's if in atmosphere like this, what I had earlier alluded to, they were marginalized. This marginalization is increasing even more. More and more Muslims are now seeking security in their numbers. They're shrinking away from the mainstream. So this is a matter of really great concern. And this has an impact, or this will have an impact on the overall development of India. If you put such a huge number, like 14.5% of your population out of the mainstream, and they are not productive, they're not producing anything, they're not generating anything for the country, then obviously it will slow down your own rate of growth. So that is a reason which fills one with despair. Uh, the hope comes from what we saw last year, this whole CA and RC protest.
Hmm.
And I realized that it's not just the Muslims who were coming out to protest because they were threatened. There were a lot of other people, non-Muslims, who were coming out to support them because they thought that this fear needed to be addressed, the fear of Muslims that they could be thrown out of the country or could be thrown into a camp if they are found that they are not the citizens of the country. So a lot of people who came, it just showed that there is hope that we can still work towards a good and a collective future where we are as we used to be, interdependent on one another. We banked on each other. So we could still reclaim some of that.
Right. And the last question for today's discussion, this comes from Basanta Gupta, who's saying, Born a Muslim, the title of your book, reminds me of Trevor Noah's title, Born a Crime. And he's wondering whether that is a subtle reference to Muslim in today's India. In other words,
No, I'll give a very honest answer. The title was not mine. It was given by the publishers. So I did not have that in mind at all. In fact, my earlier title, which I had suggested and which was a thought which had driven me to write the book, was Herding the Faithful. And I thought our ulama, our mullahs were herding the Muslims as if
Mhm.
it was a cattle.
Okay, right. All right. So we have, all right, we've actually got more questions coming, and we will definitely make this the last one because we're coming up to stoppage time. This comes from Ramesh Savarwal, and this is actually a great question to end on because we covered so many things. We were not able to really hone in on the autobiographical aspects of your book, and there's quite a bit of that at the beginning. And Ramesh is asking, as a young journalist, who was your inspiration? Did you have a role model in mind or several?
Actually, no, I did not have a specific role model in mind.
Hmm.
I was, when I was growing up, I used to read a lot of stuff, the and a lot of newspapers in vernacular, because we didn't get English newspaper at home. So I was reading the papers like Amar Ujala or Inqilab or Qawmi Awaz. So I was inspired to write something which was not as flamboyant as I would see in the vernacular newspapers,
Hmm.
but at the same time I did not like the idea of a journalist being invisible. I Because even if you are invisible, your bias shows in your writing. So I always like the idea, I like the idea of long form writing where the writer is visible, the writer is making her observations. So I don't know if this was inspired by anything specific, But one of the early books which my father had asked me to read and presented them to me were written by Dominic Lepere, Larry Collins. So it was not really journalistic; they were more historic. But
Hmm.
they used to write in a fashion which was conjuring up of imagery of incidents as if you're witness to them. And later I was quite fond of Naipaul's type of writing, whether his the travelogue come of the critiques of India or the
Yes.
Muslim world. So I liked this approach where you are approaching, you traveling, you're meeting people, so your observations are part of your journey. So it's like
Hmm.
you are discovering things and you are relaying them to your reader as you are discovering, even though you may have known you had your conclusions before you started your journey. But the way you convey it is like it's a journey itself. So I think these
And
were
that,
things which really maybe made an impact on me.
right. And I was just about to say that, conveying your own journey and bringing that into the picture, right, while being
Yes.
dispassionate and while doing reportage and, the entire homework and the entire research. And that is something that comes out radiantly in your book, because there is a deeply personal element, which I think makes the, reader empathize with the situation, empathize with the narrator, which is in this case yourself, but also the predicament of, every man or every woman who is a Muslim in India today. And I
Right.
think that is one of the very many merits of your book. Once again, before I conclude, I'll just hold this up again, right?
Oh,
And I
I'll hold
say
it
this
up
as an
too.
author, please. And I say this as an author, the best thing, okay, the best recognition for any author is a reader to pick up the book. You may or may not agree with everything. That's fine. You may have a debate. You may want to get in touch with the author and say, okay, can you explain this? But that is exactly what we want, right? We want engagement, we want inquiry, we want discussion, and if there is debate, then so be it. But let there
Absolutely.
be engagement. Ghazala, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. An hour plus 3 minutes has flown past in literally the flicker of an eyelid for me. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Tata Steel primarily for organizing this particular event, of course, but in a broader perspective, for continuing the entire series of the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet in a virtual form, in this new form amid these pandemic times. A big thank you to all the uh, other sponsors and partners who've been involved in the production and the promotion of this event. And last but not the least, a huge thank you to Malvika, Pratiti, and the entire team at Game Plan for making this possible.
Thank
So,
you so much. It was absolute pleasure talking with you and being on this forum.
likewise, and we should do more of these. So, viewers, hopefully, this was time well spent. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule on a Friday evening. Thank you, and goodbye for now.
Goodbye.
Bye.